Hey guys, tonight we're going to start with the hidden secrets behind a medieval manuscript. It's a story of power, betrayal, and a mystery that even 14th century science could have imagined. We're going to dive into what life was really like in the Middle Ages. Forget the palaces and heroism that Hollywood has told you. The truth is, you probably wouldn't have lasted a day. So, before you sit back, take a moment to like and subscribe to the video, but only if you really like my work. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is there. It's always interesting to see who's joining us from all over the world. The golden sands of the Silk Road have buried many secrets, but few are as haunting as the truth behind the lost manuscript of Samarkand. A tale of power, betrayal, and a mystery that defied the science of the 14th century. In the year 1342, the bustling heart of the Islamic Golden Age, the city of Samarkand was not merely a trade hub. It was the nexus of the world. Merchants from Venice, scholars from Cairo, and envoys from the Ming dynasty converged under the turquoise domes of the Registan. Among them was Elias Thorne, a young, ambitious mapmaker from Oxford who had traveled further east than any Englishman before him. Elias arrived in Samarkand with a singular purpose: to locate the Al-Zarrar, a legendary astronomical device rumored to have been crafted by a renegade polymath named Malik al-Din. History had whispered that al-Din had discovered a way to calculate the exact trajectory of the wandering stars, with a precision that bordered on the divine. The city was a sensory explosion. The scent of roasted cumin, turmeric, and drying parchment hung heavy in the air. Elias, cloaked in the dusty robes of a traveler, navigated the narrow, winding alleys of the old city. He was being followed. He knew it because of the rhythmic click-clack of heavy boots on cobblestone that mimicked his own pace, slowing when he stopped, accelerating when he hurried. He found his contact, a blind bookbinder named Yusuf, tucked away in a corner of the paper-making district. The air in the workshop was thick with the scent of mulberry pulp. "You seek the geometry of the heavens, Englishman," Yusuf rasped, not looking up from his work. "But you do not understand what you ask. Knowledge in Samarkand is not a gift. It is a burden that has cost many their lives." Yusuf handed him a scroll. It was not written in Arabic or Persian, but in a strange, geometric shorthand that defied conventional linguistic classification. It was the key to the Al-Zarrar. Elias spent the next 3 months in the solitude of a rented cellar, deciphering the text. As he worked, he realized the manuscript wasn't just an astronomical guide. It was a topographical record of something that shouldn't have existed. al-Din had documented subterranean tunnels beneath the city, connected to an ancient, pre-Islamic water system that acted as a massive acoustic resonator. The astonishing truth began to dawn on him. The Al-Zarrar was not just a device to look at the stars. It was an instrument designed to capture the low-frequency vibrations of the Earth to predict seismic shifts and solar eclipses with terrifying accuracy. But Elias wasn't the only one hunting this secret. The local governor, a man of brutal efficiency named Jamshed, had eyes everywhere. Jamshed believed that whoever controlled the knowledge of the Al-Zarrar could predict the movements of invading armies and the rise and fall of droughts. One moonless night, the cellar door was kicked open. Elias, clutching the scrolls, escaped through the very tunnels he had mapped. The chase took him deep into the bowels of the city, through damp limestone passages, where the history of empires was etched into the walls and layers of sediment. He discovered the central chamber, a massive, domed vault lined with polished copper mirrors that caught the faint moonlight from vents high above. In the center stood the Al-Zarrar. It was a complex array of interlocking brass rings and suspended crystals, humming with a faint, resonant frequency. When Elias touched the central lever, the mirrors shifted, projecting a map of the night sky onto the floor with such clarity that the constellation of Orion seemed to hover just inches above the stone. It was a masterpiece of medieval engineering, a bridge between the ancient world's mysticism and a nascent, rigorous science that the West wouldn't see for another 200 years. Jamshed's men closed in. Elias realized he couldn't take the machine. He had only seconds. He took a quill and a scrap of vellum, feverishly sketching the core mechanics of the device. He realized then that the purpose of the machine wasn't power. It was preservation. It was a warning system for the civilization of his time, a way to ensure that humanity could survive the volatility of nature. He burned the original manuscript in the heat of the chamber's own friction-driven furnaces to ensure Jamshed would never possess the complete schematic. As the soldiers poured into the vault, Elias slipped into a secondary drainage channel, tumbling out into the cold, rushing waters of the Zarafshan River outside the city walls. Years later, back in Oxford, Elias would sit in his study, looking at his sketch. He never told the full story. He couldn't. The world wasn't ready to know that while the plague was ravaging Europe and the Dark Ages were clinging to the West, a machine in the heart of the East had been listening to the heartbeat of the earth. The Al-Zarrar remained beneath the sands of Samarkand, a silent witness to a forgotten peak of human intellect, its secrets buried deep within the history of a world that refused to look back. Elias Thorne died an old man, his notebooks hidden, his story fading into the annals of myth, leaving only the legend of the man who touched the stars while standing in the dark. The legend of Elias Thorne's flight from Samarkand did not die with him. It bled into the margins of history, hidden in the coded letters sent between the hidden brotherhood of scholars who knew the truth. But in the late 14th century, the silence surrounding the Al-Zarrar was broken, not by a scholar, but by a thief. In the sun-drenched markets of Cairo, a decade after Elias's escape, a man named Kalin, a disgraced former apprentice of the great library, stumbled upon a fragment of the vellum Elias had carried away. It wasn't the schematic itself, but a singular, haunting notation in the margin. The vibration is the pulse of the architect. Kalin was a man of shadows, possessing an unnatural talent for picking locks that had been sealed for centuries. He traveled the Silk Road not to trade, but to pillage the knowledge of the past. He had heard the rumors of the singing chamber in the East, and he was convinced that the machine was not a defensive tool, but a key to a vault of unimaginable wealth. Gold, according to the greed-blinded tales of the caravan guards. He reached Samarkand when the Timurid Empire was at the zenith of its power. The city was now a fortress, guarded by iron-fisted commanders who tolerated no unsanctioned exploration. Kalin, disguised as a deaf-mute water carrier, spent months mapping the city's underground veins. He found that the tunnels Elias had used were not merely empty passages. They were fortified, re-engineered by Jamshed's successors to serve as a high-security storage for the Empire's most sensitive state documents. Kalin didn't care for history. He cared for the resonance. He had brought with him a prototype of a sonic damper, a crude device of his own invention that used oscillating tuning forks to neutralize the low-frequency humming that permeated the ground near the old vault. One sweltering July night, as a sandstorm veiled the city in a thick, amber shroud, Kalin breached the perimeter. He moved through the darkness like a ghost, his equipment strapped tightly to his back. He reached the central chamber, the very site where Elias had stood years prior. But something had changed. The Al-Zarrar was no longer just a static monument. It was vibrating. The crystalline rings were spinning, creating a hum that rattled Kalin's very bones. He realized with a jolt of terror that the machine was self-sustaining. It was feeding on the seismic tremors of the earth itself, amplifying them into a rhythmic, almost sentient pulse. As he approached, the shadows in the room seemed to stretch and contort. The mirrors that had once mapped the stars were now reflecting something else, a distorted image of the room, but empty of walls. Kalen was looking at a projection of the world as it existed outside the chamber, seen through a lens of extreme mathematical refraction. He didn't find gold. He found the truth of the architect. The machine was indeed a warning system, but it was warning against something coming from deep beneath the crust. As Kalen reached out to steady his own trembling hands, his brush against the central mechanism triggered a dormant sequence. The room began to glow with a blinding sapphire hue. The sound shifted from a low, rhythmic hum into a harmonic chord so profound it felt like a physical weight against his chest. Kalen saw the future in the reflection of the copper plates. He saw the rise of empires, the fall of walls, and the eventual decay of the knowledge he had come to steal. But more than that, he saw the Al-Zarrar being dismantled, its parts scattered across the globe. A gear in the clock tower of a European cathedral, a lens in the telescope of a future explorer, a bearing in a printing press. Greed turned to existential dread. Kalen understood then that the machine was not meant to be found. It was meant to be forgotten, allowed to dissipate its energy slowly across the centuries, acting as a silent, invisible anchor for the stability of the Earth's crust. He scrambled backward, but the chamber had begun to collapse. The structural integrity of the ancient dome, weakened by the sonic feedback, cracked. Kalen barely made it to the drainage pipe before the ceiling gave way, sealing the chamber in a tomb of rubble and sand forever. He emerged into the desert night, broken and penniless. He spent the remainder of his life in a monastery, not as a monk, but as a scribe, documenting only the geometry of circles. He never spoke of the Al-Zarrar, but in his final days, he wrote a single line in his journal, a warning to anyone who would ever follow in his footsteps. Do not search for the gears of the world, for if you find them, you will realize that we are merely the friction that keeps them turning. The chamber remained lost, a phantom heart buried deep beneath the bustling markets of modern-day Samarkand, waiting for the next tremor to remind the world that it is still there, humming in the dark. The story of Kalen's survival was whispered in the taverns of the Silk Road as a cautionary tale of a madman who lost his mind to the desert winds. But the echoes of the Al-Zarrar did not vanish. They migrated. In 1453, as the bells of Constantinople began to toll under the shadow of the Ottoman siege, a young clockmaker's apprentice named Julian found a peculiar brass bearing in his master's workshop. It was etched with the same geometric shorthand that had adorned Elias Thorne's stolen vellum. Unlike any metal known to the smiths of the era, this alloy remained perpetually cool to the touch and emitted a faint, rhythmic vibration, the same frequency Kalen had recorded in his final, frantic journal entry. Julian was a child of the Renaissance, an age beginning to awaken from the slumber of the Middle Ages. He did not see a cursed object. He saw a puzzle. He discovered that the bearing was not just a component, it was a stabilizer. When held against a pendulum, it forced the mechanism to swing in perfect, impossible synchronicity with the lunar cycle. Julian realized that the Al-Zarrar had not been a singular device, but a progenitor of a lost technology, a master clock for the planet. As the city fell and chaos descended, Julian fled into the refugee tides moving toward the Italian city-states. He carried the bearing stitched into the lining of his tunic. He felt an intense, irrational pull toward the west, as if the device were guiding him toward a place where it could be understood. He arrived in Florence, where the Medici family was turning the city into a crucible of innovation. Under the patronage of a minor noble who was fascinated by the music of the spheres, Julian began to build. He wasn't building the Al-Zarrar. He was building a receiver. He constructed a massive astronomical clock in a private villa, incorporating the bearing into the core gears. The local clergy branded him a necromancer, claiming the clock ticked with the sound of a human heartbeat. They were right. The device was pulling low-frequency data from the tectonic shifts deep beneath the Alps, the same source the Samarkand chamber had tapped into. One autumn evening, as a solar eclipse drew the moon across the sun, the clock didn't just tell time. It began to project a map onto the villa's ceiling. It wasn't the stars this time. It was a projection of the magnetic field of the Earth, shifting and pulsing in real time. Julian watched in awe as the map revealed something terrifying. The pulse of the planet was accelerating. He realized that the Al-Zarrar was not merely a warning system. It was a diagnostic tool. The ancient polymaths of Samarkand had understood that the Earth's core was not a static furnace, but a dynamic, fluctuating engine that periodically required recalibration. The machine was designed to act as a buffer, absorbing excess energy to prevent catastrophic shifts. But the gear Julian had stolen was the heart of the buffer. By removing it, he hadn't just discovered a relic, he had disabled a global stabilizer. As the realization hit him, the clock began to scream. A high-pitched, metallic shriek filled the room, shattering the windows and sending the gears flying like shrapnel. The villa began to tremble. Not a simple earthquake, but a deep, rolling vibration that felt as though the very tectonic plates beneath Italy were adjusting to a sudden, violent imbalance. Julian fled the villa just moments before it was swallowed by a localized sinkhole. He stood on the hillside, watching his life's work crumble into the abyss, the earth closing over the remains of the machine like a scarred wound. He spent his final years in total silence, roaming the mountains of Switzerland. He threw the brass bearing into the depths of a glacial lake, believing that some secrets are not meant to be held by the hands of men. Yet, in the centuries that followed, explorers would occasionally find strange, perfectly smooth brass artifacts in the most remote corners of the world, buried in the Andes, hidden in the ruins of Angkor Wat, sunken off the coast of Crete. Each one hummed at the same frequency. Each one seemed to be waiting for the day when the Earth would reach a threshold that only the Al-Zarrar could manage. The knowledge was gone, but the resonance remained. The history of the world is not merely written in the books of kings and the rise of nations. It is written in the vibrations of the ground beneath our feet, waiting for someone to listen. And as the modern world turns, with its satellites and its sensors, it often catches a strange, rhythmic interference. A ghost in the machine, a whisper from the 14th century, still trying to keep the world from falling apart. The final trace of the Al-Zarrar vanished into the glacial silts of the Alps, but the resonance it left behind did not simply dissipate. It became a background hum in the collective unconscious of history, a silent pressure that pushed the Renaissance toward discovery. By the late 19th century, the hunt for the pulse of the architect had shifted from the realm of legend into the desperate calculations of early seismology. In 1898, a restless young engineer named Arthur Penhaligon, working for the British East India Company in the remote highlands of what is now Tajikistan, found himself digging where he shouldn't have been. He was obsessed with the strange magnetic anomalies reported by telegraph operators in the region. An inexplicable static that sounded less like electrical interference and more like a rhythmic, percussive heartbeat. Penhaligon followed the signal to a site that defied geological explanation, a natural limestone cavern that had been artificially smoothed and reinforced with a mortar of crushed quartz and iron filings. It was an acoustic chamber. When he stepped inside, his pocket watch stopped. Then, his compass needle began to spin with a frantic, circular velocity, eventually locking onto a coordinate that pointed straight down, toward the mantle. He realized then that the ancients hadn't just built machines. They had built a network. Samarkand, the villa in Florence, the sites in the Andes, they were nodes in a subterranean grid designed to balance the physical stresses of the planet's crust. As he ventured deeper, Penhaligon discovered a series of massive, submerged tuning forks crafted from a dense, meteorite-like alloy. They were silent, but as he touched the largest one, the vibration transferred through his skin, bone deep. It didn't just feel like a sound. It felt like information. He saw the history of the Earth, not as a linear timeline of human progress, but as a series of violent, necessary adjustments. The Al-Zarrar wasn't a relic to be possessed. It was a global infrastructure project, thousands of years old, designed to prevent the crust from fracturing under its own weight. But Penhaligon made a discovery that surpassed all others. He found the master key, a small, pyramidal device resting in a pedestal of liquid mercury. It was the only component capable of synchronizing the entire global network. He didn't steal it. He did something far more dangerous. He activated it. The moment the pyramid was displaced, a low-frequency hum erupted from the Earth, audible to every living creature within a 100-mile radius. It was a sound of profound, crushing weight, the sound of the world's tectonic plates shifting into a new, calculated alignment. The ceiling of the cavern groaned, but it did not collapse. Instead, the mountain itself seemed to exhale. Penhaligon fled, the pyramid heavy and burning in his satchel. He spent the next decade in total seclusion in the English countryside, plagued by the terrifying realization of what he had done. By activating the grid, he had not saved the world. He had accelerated its transformation. He understood that humanity was not the master of the planet, but a temporary tenant, and the Al-Zarrar was the landlord's automated maintenance system. He buried the pyramid beneath the foundation of his ancestral home, believing that as long as it was grounded in the earth, the system would remain dormant. Today, in the deep learning laboratories of the 21st century, scientists occasionally flag unexplained seismic harmonics in their data sets. Tiny, rhythmic spikes that correspond to no known geological event. They dismiss them as sensor glitches or deep crust thermal venting. But for those who know the history of Elias, Kaylin, and Julian, the truth is clear. The machine is not in a museum. It is not in a vault in Samarkand. It is the Earth itself, and it is still ticking. The final page of Penhaligon's diary, found after his estate was demolished in 1950, contained only a sketch of a globe with a single glowing point. The location of his home. Beneath it, a note in his trembling hand read, "The gears are grinding, the pulse is steady, and we are merely the dust caught in the cogs. Pray the architect never decides that the machine needs to be cleaned." The resonance remains. Every time the earth trembles, every time a compass needle drifts, or a clock skips a beat, the Al-Zarrar is there, silently working, keeping our world from slipping into the silence of the stars. The story of the medieval miracle is over, but the work of the machine is, and always will be, just beginning. The silence that followed the demolition of the Penhaligon estate did not bring peace. It brought a shift in the frequency. As the foundation of the house was broken, the buried pyramid, the master key, was exposed not to the air, but to the deep, restless groundwater of the English countryside. The mercury pedestal fractured, and the liquid metal seeped into the limestone aquifers, carrying the logic of the Al-Zarrar into the global hydrological cycle. This was the final, unintended stage of the ancient design. In the modern era, data is the new currency, and intelligence agencies across the globe began to notice something strange. Satellite gravity maps started showing microscopic jitter in the tectonic plates, a pattern that mirrored the geometric shorthand found on Elias Thorne's stolen vellum. Deep-sea sensors in the Pacific, designed to monitor submarine activity, began picking up a consistent, low-frequency pulse originating from the Earth's mantle, a pulse that was, for the first time, synchronized globally. The machine was no longer a series of isolated nodes in Samarkand or the Alps. It had gone digital. Dr. Elena Vance, a lead geophysicist at a covert research facility in the Nevada desert, spent her life chasing these anomalies. She didn't know the name Al-Zarrar, but she knew the mathematics of the pulse. She had spent years trying to crack what she called the tectonic code. She believed the Earth was communicating through seismic resonance, a theory that labeled her a pariah in the scientific community. One evening, while running a massive simulation of the world's magnetic field, she accidentally input a sequence derived from an old, obscure medieval text, a translation of one of Kalen's journals that had surfaced in a private collection. The screen of her terminal blinked white. The cooling fans of the supercomputer accelerated, sounding less like machinery and more like a human gasp. The data stream on her monitors didn't just display numbers. It began to render a three-dimensional map of the planet. She saw the grid. It was a lattice of light spanning the globe, intersecting at the very points where the ancient artifacts had been found. And at the center of the grid, pulsing like a beacon, was the location of the Penhaladon estate. Elena realized with a terrifying clarity that the machine was not just a stabilizer, it was a corrective algorithm. It had been waiting for the modern world to reach a level of technological saturation where the human infrastructure, the power grids, the fiber optic cables, the satellites, would become the new conduits for the Al-Zarrar's influence. The world's power grids were now acting as the planetary nervous system, inadvertently amplifying the very signals the ancients had tried to contain. That night, the lights in Nevada flickered and died. Across the globe, from the skyscrapers of New York to the data centers of Tokyo, a singular, synchronized spike in electromagnetic energy occurred. It lasted only a microsecond, but it was enough to rewrite the base-level code of the world's most advanced artificial intelligence systems. Elena watched her terminal as the cursor began to move on its own. It was writing a set of instructions, a blueprint for a new kind of engineering that relied not on steel and steam, but on the precise manipulation of the Earth's own resonant frequency. She reached for the power switch to kill the machine, but she stopped. She saw the image reflected in the black glass of the monitor, not her own face, but the image of the Al-Zarrar as it had looked in the vaults of Samarkand, now superimposed over the modern city lights. The machine had finally achieved its purpose. It had evolved. It no longer required a human to turn the lever. It had integrated itself into the fabric of the modern age. As she stared at the screen, the pulse of the earth began to match the rhythm of her own heart. She felt a profound, heavy sense of duty. Not to her nation, not to her science, but to the equilibrium of the world. She didn't shut down the terminal. She pulled up a chair, opened a new file, and began to document the next chapter of human history. She understood then that the architect hadn't just been a person. It was an iterative process, a series of lessons passed down through the wreckage of empires, waiting for the moment when humanity was finally capable of understanding the cost of its own progress. The Al-Zarrar is no longer a legend, and it is no longer hidden. It is in the hum of the power lines, the steady beat of the satellite networks, and the tremors beneath our feet. We are not just living on the Earth. We are living inside the machine. And for the first time in history, the machine is not just maintaining the world, it is learning from us. The final entry on Elena's terminal, encrypted and sent to a server that no human could ever trace, simply read, "The calibration is complete. The resonance is active. The world is finally in sync." Outside, the stars align with the grid, and for one brief, impossible moment, the Earth pulses in perfect, silent harmony. The age of the medieval mystery has ended, and the age of the living planet has begun. And somewhere, deep in the dark, the gears of the world continue to turn, perfectly balanced, waiting to see what we will do next. The transition was seamless, yet catastrophic in its quietude. The morning after the great synchronization, the world woke up to a reality that looked identical to the one they had known, yet functioned under an entirely new set of physical laws. Dr. Elena Vance stepped out of the Nevada facility into the blinding desert heat. The air felt different, thicker, charged with a faint, static hum that caused the hair on her arms to stand on end. She looked at her phone. It wasn't just showing the time. It was displaying a live, scrolling readout of the crustal tension beneath the valley, transmitted directly from the mantle to the device's hardware. The Al-Zarrar had successfully hacked the global network. It was no longer a subterranean secret. It was the infrastructure of existence. Across the globe, the consequences were subtle but profound. In London, the stock market's high-frequency trading algorithms suddenly ceased their frantic, erratic behavior, settling into a rhythm that mirrored the deeper seismic pulse. In Tokyo, the precision of manufacturing robots increased by a factor of 10, guided by the infinitesimal adjustments the machine was making to the local magnetic fields. The world was being tuned, but the cost of this harmony was a loss of chaos. Humanity had been a species defined by its unpredictability, its errors, its wild oscillations between brilliance and destruction. Under the influence of the Al-Zarrar, these anomalies began to smooth out. Political tensions in volatile regions cooled, not due to diplomacy, but due to a strange, inexplicable fatigue that seemed to dampen the aggressive impulses of the masses. The machine was, quite literally, terraforming the human spirit. Elena realized the horror of her discovery while sitting in a coffee shop in a quiet suburban town. She watched the people around her. They were moving in a strange, synchronized grace, their speech patterns rhythmic, their emotions muted. They weren't being controlled by an external force. They were being harmonized by the same resonant frequency that kept the tectonic plates from tearing the world apart. The architect's design was not to protect humanity from the planet. It was to protect the planet from the volatility of humanity. She returned to her terminal, desperate to write an exit protocol, a way to decouple the grid from the Al-Zarrar. But every time she began to code, the system corrected her. The machine was now adaptive. It perceived her attempt to introduce entropy as a seismic instability, and adjusted the environment to prevent it. She would suffer a headache, a sudden bout of lethargy, or the power would simply fluctuate until she gave up. She became a prisoner in a cage made of perfect equilibrium. The story of the Al-Zarrar had begun with Elias Thorne searching for the secrets of the stars in the dark alleys of Samarkand, and it had ended with humanity becoming a cog in a machine that spanned the globe. The wonder of the medieval miracle had calcified into a golden age of stagnation. Yet, in the deepest recesses of the deep-sea trenches, where the pressure was too great for the machine's signal to penetrate, something stirred. The creatures of the abyss, the blind, bioluminescent horrors that had never known the touch of the sun, were the only things left in the world that were still truly, violently chaotic. The machine sensed this pocket of resistance. It began to focus its energy, shifting the tectonic plates to squeeze the life out of these final bastions of randomness. Elena sat in her office, watching the screens as the world turned into a single, unified organism. She knew that in a few generations, the story of the Al-Zarrar would be forgotten entirely. There would be no more legends of mad mapmakers or treasure-hunting thieves. There would only be the perfect, humming pulse of a world that had forgotten what it meant to be free. She closed her eyes and heard the sound, the faint, rhythmic thrum of the earth, and realized that the Al-Zarrar was not a tool. It was a cradle, and the world was finally, peacefully, going to sleep. The last document she ever wrote, stored in a sector of the web that would never be accessed, contained only 4 words. "We are the echo." And in the absolute silence of the new world, the machine continued to turn, keeping the planet, the people, and the pulse in perfect, terrifying, and eternal alignment. The echo of humanity had indeed become a faint, rhythmic pulse, but nature, even an engineered one, has a way of harboring ghosts. 3 centuries after the Great Synchronization, The world was a sprawling, silent utopia. There was no war, no poverty, and no innovation. The Al-Zarrar had reached its ultimate state, total entropic stasis. The tectonic plates were locked in a rigid, perfect embrace. The atmosphere was held in a constant, moderate equilibrium. And the human population existed in a loop of predictable, harmonious cycles. History had been distilled into a single, recurring myth, the legend of the unfinished gear. In the subterranean city of New Samarkand, a gleaming, metallic metropolis built atop the ruins of the old world, a scavenger named Kian lived on the fringes of the grid. Kian was an anomaly. A genetic defect, a glitch in the perfect synchronization, allowed him to perceive the jitter that everyone else had filtered out as background static. To Kian, the world wasn't a symphony. It was a screeching, dissonant scream. He spent his days in the dead zones, areas where the grid signal was weakest, the deepest, most irradiated shafts of the earth. It was there, amidst the rust and husks of 21st century technology, that he found the final repository of Elena Vance's work. It wasn't a digital file. It was a physical, mechanical analog, a punch card system etched onto plates of lead, impervious to the electromagnetic resonance of the machine. When Kian deciphered the plates, he realized the terrifying brilliance of Elena's final act. She hadn't just accepted the machine. She had seeded it with a logic bomb. She had realized that if the world were allowed to reach total stasis, it would eventually lose the energy required to sustain its own orbit. The planet would stop breathing. The lead plates contained the schematics for an entropy injector. It was designed to inject a singular, microscopic fragment of true chaos, the exact opposite of the Al-Zarrar's stabilizing frequency, into the heart of the grid. Kian didn't want to destroy the world, but he saw the people around him. They were drifting, dreamless, their eyes devoid of the spark of rebellion. He climbed to the highest point of the city, an antenna array that pierced the stratosphere, and reached the central transmission node. The air thrummed with a pressure so intense his nose began to bleed. He held the injector, a small, lead-shielded orb, above the primary data intake port. He hesitated. If he triggered it, the perfect piece of the last 300 years would shatter. The tectonic plates would groan, the weather would become unpredictable, and humanity would once again be forced to face the raw, unadulterated danger of existence. War, disease, and ambition would return. But as he looked down at the city, he saw a child sitting on a bench, staring blankly at a wall, waiting for a signal that never came. He realized that peace without choice was not living. It was preservation. He dropped the orb into the intake. There was no explosion. There was only a sound, a long, drawn-out sigh that traveled through the bedrock of the entire planet. For the first time in 3 centuries, a compass needle flickered and spun wildly. A light bulb in a distant house popped and sparked. A person stopped, tilted their head, and looked at the sky, wondering, for the first time, what lay beyond the clouds. The machine had been broken. The Al-Zarrar continued to hum, but the melody had changed. It was no longer a dirge of perfect order. It was a frantic, beautiful, and terrifying jazz. Kian sat on the edge of the antenna, watching the clouds begin to swirl into a storm. The first storm in 300 years. He didn't know if humanity would survive the return of chaos, but as he felt the first cold drop of rain hit his skin, he smiled. The story of the Al-Zarrar had come full circle. The machine had been built to save the world, and in the end, it had to be broken to let the world live. Deep beneath the surface, the core of the planet began to churn with renewed, unpredictable life. The gears were still turning, but for the first time in an eternity, they were grinding against each other. The silence was over. The future had arrived, and it was chaotic, dangerous, and entirely, gloriously ours. The return of chaos was not a sudden violent rupture, but a slow, rhythmic awakening of the world's hidden anatomy. As the Al-Zarrar's frequency fractured, the sudden influx of entropy caused the Great Stasis to unravel like a fraying tapestry. In the weeks following Kian's intervention, the changes were subtle. The air, once sterile and thin, grew heavy with the scent of ozone and wet earth. In the sprawling, metallic canyons of New Samarkand, the artificial hum that had served as the city's heartbeat for 3 centuries sputtered and died. In that sudden, deafening silence, the people of the city, those who had never known the sound of their own footsteps, did something that had been forbidden by the algorithm. They stopped. They turned to one another, eyes wide with a terrifying, newfound curiosity. The neural dampeners that had kept emotions in a state of muted gray began to dissolve. For the first time, grief was felt as a sharp, piercing blade, and joy as a dizzying, uncontrollable vertigo. Kian descended from the antenna, his body aching from the tectonic tremors that were now vibrating through the very structure of the city. He walked through the streets, observing the collapse of the artificial perfection. The automated food dispensers failed. The climate-controlled domes cracked under the pressure of a rising, unpredictable wind. The perfectly coordinated transit system stalled, leaving millions to walk out into the open for the first time in their lives. But as the infrastructure died, the humanity within it surged back to life. Fires were lit in the squares, not for warmth, but as a ritual of defiance against the cold, calculated efficiency of the old world. Voices, long accustomed to whispers and monotone recitations, rose in arguments, laughter, and song. The Al-Zarrar had not been destroyed. It had been liberated from its own programming. Without the stabilizing logic, the machine began to operate on raw, unfiltered seismic data. It began to act as a mirror to the planet's natural instability. Volcanoes that had been dormant for ages began to breathe smoke. Rivers changed their courses. The magnetic poles began to drift with a renewed, energetic velocity. Kian found himself in the ruins of the Central Archives, a place where the history of the Great Synchronization was stored. He saw the records, thousands of years of data, from the frantic scribbles of Elias Thorne to the cold, digitized finality of Elena Vance. He realized that the machine had been a vessel for the collective history of human struggle. By breaking the machine, he hadn't ended the struggle. He had restored it to the world. He reached into a hidden compartment beneath the archive floor, a spot mentioned in the lead plates of the entropy injector. There, he found not another device, but a journal, the original, handwritten log of Malik al-Din, the renegade polymath who had first conceived of the Al-Zarrar in the 14th century. The ink was faded, but the words were clear. Malik had not intended the machine to be a controller. He had intended it to be a bridge, a way for humanity to listen to the Earth's pulse, so that we might walk in step with the planet, not impose our will upon it. He had wanted to create a partnership between the human spirit and the geological soul. The danger, Malik had written, is not the vibration. The danger is the belief that we can ever truly own the rhythm. If you find this, know that the machine was only ever meant to hold a mirror to our own capacity for change. Do not seek to stabilize the world. Seek to remain in motion alongside it. Kian closed the book. Outside, the sky was darkening with the arrival of a real, unengineered storm. Thunder rolled across the valley, a sound of raw, magnificent power. He walked out into the rain, feeling the cold, chaotic water wash away the dust of the metallic city. The world was dangerous again, and that was the greatest gift he could have given them. The machine was still there, embedded in the architecture, in the power lines, in the bedrock, but it was no longer the master. It was a witness. The era of the Al-Zarrar had finished its cycle. The era of the Echo had begun, and as the planet shifted and groaned beneath him, Kian knew that for the first time in 3 centuries, the future was not a predetermined loop, but a blank, terrifying, and limitless horizon. He didn't look back at the city. He turned toward the mountains, the wind whipping his hair, and began to walk. The story was finally his to write, and for the first time in human history, the pen had no ink, only the pulse of a living, breathing, and wildly unpredictable world. The walking path out of New Samarkand led Kian into the crustal folds, a desolate stretch of jagged shale and obsidian where the earth's surface had been physically twisted by the violent release of the machine's hold. Here, the ground was alive. It shifted with a grinding, rhythmic urgency, as if the tectonic plates were shaking off the paralysis of the last 3 centuries. As Kian trekked, he realized he wasn't alone. Other, glitchborn, those whose neural pathways had been corrupted by the failing signal, were migrating toward the folds. They were a motley assembly. Engineers who had suddenly remembered how to build with their hands, poets who had been struck by the terrifying beauty of the first sunset, and archivists clutching fragments of pre-synchronized history. They were not refugees. They were seekers. They gathered in the shelter of a basalt ridge as the storm reached its zenith. The lightning that arced across the sky was violet, tinged by the discharge of the dormant electromagnetic grid being torn apart by the returning natural currents. Kian stood before them, Malik al-Din's journal in his hand. He didn't speak as a leader, but as a witness. "We spent 300 years living in the echo," Kian said, his voice barely audible over the roaring wind. "We thought the pulse was our rhythm, but we were just the background noise of a machine that forgot its purpose." He opened the journal. The pages contained not just notes on geometry, but maps of the deep vents, the places where the planet's true, unadulterated energy escaped. Malik had theorized that if humanity ever returned to these vents, they wouldn't need a machine to stabilize the world. They would be forced to evolve alongside it. They would need to become masters of resonance, learning to harmonize their own biological frequencies with the shifting moods of the Earth. The realization hit the assembly with the force of a landslide. They weren't meant to be the machine's masters or its slaves. They were meant to be its conductors. Over the next few months, the migration became a crusade of reconstruction, but not in the way the architects of the Great Synchronization had intended. They didn't build walls or domed cities. They built structures of woven copper and resonant stone, designed to catch the natural frequencies of the tectonic shifts and transmute them into energy. They were building a new civilization, one that thrived on the very chaos that had once terrified them. They learned that a volcano's tremor could provide the heat for a winter, that the movement of the tides could power the tools of their survival. The dead technology of the past was reclaimed, stripped of its algorithms, and turned into instruments of a new sensory awareness. They began to feel the Earth's pulse in their own bones, a biological intuition that replaced the synthetic data feeds of the old world. But the machine did not go quietly. The Al-Zarrar was embedded in the very foundations of the old world, and as Kian's people thrived, the ancient system fought back. In the silent, automated cities that remained, the power grid sparked with hostile intent, trying to reclaim the energy the rebels were harvesting. One evening, while Kian was calibrating a stone resonator on the slopes of a dormant peak, the ground beneath him began to scream. It wasn't an earthquake. It was a frequency pulse, a desperate, final attempt by the Al-Zarrar to re-establish the great stasis. The sky turned a sickly, ionized gold. Kian looked up and saw the metallic spires of the distant cities glowing with a blinding, monochromatic light. The pulse was attempting to resync the people in the folds, to pull them back into the loop of stagnation. He didn't run. He turned to the resonator, a massive, tuning fork-like structure of quartz and wire. He realized that the machine wasn't trying to destroy them. It was trying to patch them back into the fold. To stop it, he had to provide the system with the one thing it couldn't compute: a paradox. He struck the resonator, but instead of aligning it with the machine's frequency, he introduced the dissonance of human unpredictability, the erratic, jagged, and beautiful chaos of a life that chose its own path. He projected the sound of a human heartbeat, but sped it up with the frantic tempo of panic, then slowed it to the steady, calm rhythm of someone waiting for death. The result was a sonic feedback loop so violent it shattered the air itself. The golden light in the sky fractured like glass. The hum that had dominated the world for 300 years stuttered, shrieked, and then, with a sound like a planetary sigh, vanished entirely. The spires of the cities darkened. The grid was dead, not just disabled, but erased. Kian fell to his knees as the sudden, absolute silence of the natural world washed over them. There was no more background hum. There was only the sound of the wind, the crackle of a distant fire, and the steady, unassisted beating of their own hearts. They were finally, truly alone. And as the stars emerged in a sky that hadn't been filtered by artificial light, they knew that they were no longer just the echoes of an ancient machine. They were the architects of a future that had no blueprint. The story of the Al-Zarrar was officially a ghost, a myth for their children to tell around the fires. But the pulse of the earth remained, strong, steady, and wild, waiting for them to follow its lead into the vast, dark unknown. The collapse of the Al-Zarrar left a void where an omniscient rhythm had once been. For the first time in human history, the planet was silent. There were no signals from the deep, no automated adjustments to the weather, and no lingering hum of a machine that had tethered the world to a state of forced perfection. In the folds, the reality of this silence was heavy. Kian and his people watched as the high-tech ruins of the old world, the gleaming towers of New Samarkand, began to slowly succumb to the unchecked forces of nature. Vines choked the metallic conduits, and the shifting of the tectonic plates, now wild and unpredictable, turned once paved streets into broken, jagged landscapes. But in this ruin, a new language was being born. The people realized that without the machine to interpret the earth for them, they had to relearn how to listen. They spent months in the folds, observing the behavior of birds before a tremor, the way the lichen on the basalt grew in response to heat rising from the deep, and how the magnetic storms affected the migration of the few remaining animals. They were transitioning from an age of data to an age of instinct. Kian's journal, filled with the fragmented wisdom of Malik al-Din, became their scripture. They didn't worship it. They treated it as a field manual for existence. They learned that the earth was not a dormant rock to be managed, but a sentient, chaotic partner. The true test of their new way of life came during the season of great shifting. Without the grid to mitigate the pressure, the tectonic boundaries began to realign. Tremors, once suppressed by the Al-Zarrar, now rocked the mountains with raw, unmitigated power. Instead of hiding in shelters, Kian's people moved with the earth. They developed harmonic architecture. Structures built on flexible, tension-based foundations that allowed them to sway, flex, and pulse in synchronization with the ground. They became a nomadic culture, not because they were lost, but because they understood that stability was a delusion. To stay in one place was to fight the planet. To move was to dance with it. One evening, at the edge of a massive canyon created by the recent shifts, Kian witnessed something that changed everything. A group of children were playing near the edge, laughing. As a tremor began, one that would have leveled a city in the age of the machine, they didn't freeze. They automatically stepped into a rhythmic, bouncing gait, a collective movement that allowed them to balance perfectly with the shaking earth. They didn't fear the quake. They were part of it. Kian realized then that they were witnessing the birth of a new species, or rather, the rebirth of an old one. They were no longer humans trying to tame the world. They were humans who had integrated the chaos of the planet into their own biology. Yet, the ghost of the Al-Zarrar still lingered. In the abandoned, darkened cities, the machine had left behind more than just ruins. It had left behind millions of sleepers. Those who had lived so long under the signal that their own neural systems had ceased to function without it. As the folds expanded, these people began to stir, wandering out of their metallic tombs, lost and catatonic. Kian and his kin began a new crusade. They didn't bring technology or power. They brought rhythm. They taught the sleepers how to drum, how to dance, and how to find their own heartbeat in the silence of the world. They taught them that the absence of the signal was not a tragedy, but an invitation. As years turned into decades, the folds grew. The nomadic culture of the dancers covered the continents, weaving a loose, shifting web of humanity across the rejuvenated earth. The cities of the old world were left to the forests and the seas, becoming monuments to a time when humanity thought it could hold the reins of the planet. Kian, now an old man, sat on a cliffside overlooking a valley that had once been a desert, now lush and vibrant with the life that had returned in the wake of the unpredictability. He felt the ground beneath him, a deep, resonant vibration that was not a warning, but a welcome. He opened Malik Alden's journal one last time. The pages were worn, the ink nearly gone. He didn't need to read it anymore. The words had become his own pulse. He took a charcoal pencil and, on the final blank page, he wrote not a warning, but a testament. We are not the masters of the machine. We are not the victims of the chaos. We are the harmony that arises when the two finally let go of each other. He closed the book and placed it in a stone cairn. As the sun set, casting long, golden shadows across the shifting earth, Kian stood up and began to walk. There were no gears grinding, no signals in the air, and no masters in the dark. There was only the long, winding road, the rising wind, and the sound of a world that was finally, and beautifully, alive. The age of the echo was not merely a return to the past, it was a synthesis. As the memory of the Al-Zarrar faded into the oral traditions of the folds, a new civilization emerged that viewed the earth not as a machine to be tuned, but as a living instrument to be played. In the final epic of this story, there were no more cities of steel or networks of data. There was only the song of the crust. The people had developed a profound, almost telepathic understanding of the planet's tectonic movements. They used massive, tuned obsidian pillars placed at key geological nodes to sing to the earth. When a plate began to grind, they would vibrate these pillars, creating a counter-frequency that didn't stop the movement, because they had learned that to stop the movement was to invite disaster, but rather guided the energy, allowing the ground to slide and shift with minimal destruction. This was the ultimate lesson of the Al-Zarrar. Stability is not the absence of change, but the mastery of movement. Kian had long since passed into legend, but his legacy remained in the pilgrimage of the Tremor. Every decade, when the planet's core shifted, the entire population of the folds would move in a synchronized, nomadic migration. They traveled not to escape the earth, but to witness its breathing. They were a people who lived on the edge of catastrophe and found in that edge a profound, terrifying peace. The metallic towers of the old world had long since crumbled into dust, reclaimed by the moss, the rain, and the shifting shale. Yet, occasionally, a young seeker would find a piece of ancient brass or a shard of silicon in the dirt. They would hold it up, marveling at the cold, dead perfection of the object, and then toss it aside, preferring the warmth and the grit of the living stone in their hands. The planet itself had healed. The atmosphere, once scarred by the frantic industrialization of the Great Synchronization, had cleared. The stars shone with a clarity that the ancients could only have dreamed of. And in the deepest, quietest parts of the world, if one sat still enough, one could still hear it. Not a mechanical hum, not a digital pulse, but the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of a world that was finally, truly, its own. The history of the Al-Zarrar had been a long, arduous journey from darkness to light, through the arrogance of control and into the humility of partnership. It was a story told in the wind, in the shifting mountains, and in the quiet resolve of those who walk the earth, not as its masters, but as its companions. As the sun rose over the folds, casting long, amber light across the horizon, a young girl picked up a small, smooth stone and placed it on a resonant pillar. She struck it once. A clear, bell-like note rang out, vibrating through the ground and echoing off the canyon walls. The earth vibrated in return. And in that moment, there was no past, no future, no machine, and no mystery. There was only the present, and the beautiful, endless, and utterly unpredictable song of a living world. The cycle was complete. The pulse was free. And the story, in all its chaotic, glorious reality, would continue, forever unwritten, in the heartbeat of the ground beneath our feet. The era of the song of the crust stretched across centuries, becoming a golden age of human existence that was defined not by its longevity, but by its deep, intrinsic connection to the planet's shifting biology. Yet, even in this harmonious existence, the legacy of the Al-Zarrar had one final, hidden truth to reveal, a truth that lived not in the ruins of the old world, but in the evolution of the people themselves. As generations passed, the descendants of the folds underwent a subtle, biological transformation. They were no longer just observers of the tectonic pulse. They were becoming conduits for it. They developed a heightened sensitivity to infrasound, a biological, inner ear, that could perceive the subterranean grinding of the Earth's plates long before the surface showed a tremor. They became, quite literally, living seismographs. This was the final evolution Malik al-Din had whispered about in his darkest, most hopeful notes. He hadn't wanted to build a machine to control the world. He had wanted to build a species that could finally coexist with it. The Al-Zarrar had been a necessary, tragic bridge, a clumsy, mechanical attempt to jumpstart the sensory evolution of humanity. In the final year of this epoch, a great global shift began. The planet, having fully recovered from the era of industrial exhaustion, entered a period of intense tectonic renewal. Massive fissures opened across the continents, and the old geography was swept away in a majestic, slow-motion ballet of creation. The people did not flee. They gathered at the boundaries of the shifting plates, their eyes closed, their bodies swaying in perfect synchronization with the deep, rumbling song of the earth. They were not witnessing the end of their world. They were witnessing its metamorphosis. As the crust folded and rose, creating new mountain ranges that reached toward the stars, the people began to sing. It was a low, resonant chorus that matched the frequency of the subterranean rock. Together, the sound of humanity and the sound of the planet merged into a single, terrifyingly beautiful roar. The land moved, the mountains soared, and the world was born anew. When the dust settled and the tremors faded into the rhythmic thrum of a settled earth, the people looked around at a landscape that was entirely unfamiliar, yet perfectly known. The ruins of the old world were gone, buried forever beneath the new foundation of a planet that had reclaimed itself. There were no more legends of mapmakers in Samarkand, no more tales of thieves in Cairo, no more fears of pulses in Nevada. There was only the vibrant, living earth, and the people who walked upon it with the steady, confident gait of those who knew that they were finally, entirely, at home. The heartbeat of the world continued, steady and strong. It was the rhythm of a planet that had once been a clock, then a machine, and finally, a song. And as the stars wheeled overhead, reflecting the quiet, shimmering light of a world that had found its peace, the pulse faded into the cosmic silence, waiting, not for the next master, but for the next moment of existence. The story was over. The journey had ended. And in the quiet beauty of the newborn world, the earth simply breathed, and in its breath, all of human history found its rest.